Welcome to Book Backstory. My name is Carla Brandenburg, and I'm an award-winning author of romantic suspense and paranormal novels. This podcast is a walk along my journey. Meet some of my favorite authors, find out what gets me excited to write a new book, and the stumbling blocks during the process. Today I want to talk about where the characters come in a novel. Sometimes starting a new book is easy. I have a clear picture of my main players and what they're after. Sometimes it isn't so easy. Example: when I started writing Breaking the Mold, the plan had been to start with Yolanda from Cookie Therapy. She worked in the bakery next to the bookstore. Yolanda is in the new book, for sure, but it's her family that takes center stage more than her, and her big brother who is my hero. As for the female lead, well, she stumbled into the story when I wasn't paying attention and stole the show. Wait, wasn't I talking about clear pictures of main players? I suppose what I'm getting at is the two leads in Breaking the Mold stepped right up to tell me their stories. When writing a series, main characters tend to be easier because you already know them from previous books, or at least you have an idea what's going on with them. Examples of when main characters aren't so easy? When I started writing Epitaph, I couldn't seem to get Amy right. It took me several years before I finally discovered what was missing. But once I did, it launched the series. Characters can come at me from all directions, from someone I've met to a picture I've seen. Many authors base their characters on movie stars. I'm not one of those, for the record, although I have borrowed a look from the silver screen. I'm going to divert to the villain for a moment. I'm sure you've seen the memes about not upsetting the author or she'll put you in a book and kill you. That's truer than you might suspect. With that being said, there was only one person I was upset enough about to actually incorporate into a story. Since this podcast is called Book Backstory, I'm going to give you the backstory on that particular villain. The CEO of the company where I worked hired a new guy in management. He made no bones about saying that this guy was hired for a reason. Unfortunately, we all thought it was a different reason than it turned out to be. The man turned into a hatchet guy. Whether that was the original intent or not, he inspired fear in everyone around him. He was misogynistic and took great delight in making people uncomfortable. Most of us tried to fly under the radar, and if he singled you out, you cleared out your desk in anticipation of what was to come. I know I did. He did go a step too far once or twice, and at least one of his decisions was reversed. Long story short, he eventually became redundant, as they say, through the power of a merger, which might have been the only way for the CEO to correct the mistake he'd made. Or the guy had accomplished his purpose. I guess us little people will never know. At any rate, I wrote Living Canvas during his reign of terror. The antagonist in the story bears no physical resemblance to that man. And in a twist of fate, more than 10 years later, one of the models I did use to fashion him after has become an icon of evil in his own right. This is where I tell you that characters are fictional. While I tapped into my dread of the man I worked for, the character became someone else entirely. It's important to note that of the few people who have inspired characters, I mold them into characters that fit the stories, which means they are not true reflections. Even my evil boss. Complicated relationships might make for good stories, but when they're too close to home, I stick to the advice I learned when I first started writing. If you haven't resolved the issues in your own personal life, you don't know how the story ends. In other words, it's smarter not to incorporate real relationships, especially those you care about. Okay, back to the main highway of this podcast. I'm currently writing a book, and I don't have a solid idea who my hero is. I've borrowed the heroine from the Hoffman Grove series. She asked to be featured, so I know all about her. This happens frequently, and I've discovered that if I just write, I discover more about my characters within the first 3 chapters. When that doesn't happen, it's time to go to the literal drawing board. When creating a character, it's good to start with a character sketch. What does he look like? A quick trip through Pinterest often helps me here. Or if I have a name that I've pulled out of a hat, I'll Google people with that name. Where does he live? Or where does he come from? What kind of a car does he drive? Car selection says a lot about a person. What do you see when you walk into his house? Some characters are neat, and others are Oscar Madison slobs. This is important because it speaks to his personality. Is he easygoing or structured? What's his fatal flaw or biggest weakness? In line with this, not everyone is, quote-unquote, good all the time. What does his dark side look like? Is he the jealous type? Does he respond aggressively to criticism? And there's the question every writing program I've ever seen poses. What makes him stand out in a crowd? Does he have a distinguishing character trait? In my first book, the hero had a habit of ticking his fingers off against his thumb, a sure sign he was annoyed. Then you need to get into more visceral descriptions. What does his voice sound like? Deep and sonorous, or does it grate? What does he smell like? Pheromones are sometimes targeted, so what smells good to one person might be off-putting to someone else. These can be targeted to your hero and your heroine because it depends on what attracts one person to another, and what one person sees as good and positive, another might totally find disgusting. Characters need jobs, which also tells you about them, the things they like to do, or the pressures they've had to succumb to. Which brings me to his support system, his family, friends, enemies. How do they influence the person he is or is meant to be? How is he going to grow over the course of the story? Does he have a catchphrase? Maybe he's a yeah kind of guy, or he says, all good. Shout out to Coach Allgood. We all know Matthew McConaughey based on all right. Most important, what are your character's goals, their motivation in the story, and their conflict? Every character needs a purpose. Even the villains need a character arc to define who they are and who they will become. Harry Potter fans still debate whether Snape was a hero or a villain. Or was he both once his character arc was achieved? After you've answered the descriptive questions, you get deeper into their personalities. His goals might be job-related, or he might have a personal goal of climbing Mount Everest. Then you have to ask why he has this goal, and what gets in his way. These are the basics to help make a three-dimensional character a person. When I've run into problems creating characters, it's often because I've overlooked some of these basic questions. In Epitaph, once I discovered Amy had siblings, the story cracked wide open. When I'm really stumped, there are Enneagram tests readily available online. I used one for Cinda, who readers had a very strong reaction to in Living Canvas. I determined to redeem her and return to Hoffman Grove. I needed to find out more about her. Mapping her personality made a big difference. I have a series Bible that I use for all my books. In that Bible, I have a character interview that asks these and more questions. Often, once I've learned the basics, I'll discover I've missed the boat on some of the answers, and will have to make adjustments based on what I discover while writing the story. Characters can be cagey that way. They withhold something, or give you the wrong answer. Not as easy as you thought, huh? And not as simple as throwing your favorite Uncle Joe into a story, or a coworker who annoys the heck out of you. Every character has their good points, along with their not-so-good points. Much of what I discovered during the process doesn't make it into the book, but it helps the author to understand what makes their character ticks, and, therefore, makes for a better story. Thanks for listening to this episode of Book Bag Story. I hope you found the information informative.